The Freedom House Raising Awareness Award recognizes individuals who advance the cause of freedom by informing and inspiring others. This year's award recipient, Nazanin Boniadi, is one of the most stirring voices in advocacy today. Born in Tehran at the height of the Iranian Revolution, her parents moved to London shortly thereafter because they did not want to raise their daughter in a place that was growing increasingly oppressive towards women and girls. The move shaped her view of the world. Nazanin's advocacy and charitable work is as impressive as her acting career. She is a leading example of what it means to use your own powerful voice to give a voice to those in need. Please welcome Freedom House Board of Trustees member Goli Ameri in conversation with Nazanin Boniadi.
Nazanin, welcome. We're delighted to have you here. We're very proud of what you've accomplished. I was thinking that you and I have something in common. The Iranian Revolution changed the direction of both of our lives, which is probably why we both care deeply about the cause of freedom, because we want everybody else in the world to have the same choices and opportunities that we've had. I want to hear from you as to what this moment of history meant to you and did for you.
Thank you, Goli. This is a real privilege. Thank you, Freedom House. And I know the word privilege is used very often and freely when people are being acknowledged, but those words have particular meaning for me. I was born in the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution in 1979. My mother was actually pregnant with me during the revolution. And when she was 9 months pregnant, my parents decided to leave Iran and move to London, England. They didn't want to raise their child in a social, legal, and political climate that was growing increasingly oppressive, particularly towards women and girls. But when they were at the airport, my father heard his name on the public announcement system at the airport, and he was being summoned to the Revolutionary Court. And at the time, the head of the Revolutionary Court was the notorious hanging judge, Ayatollah Khalkhali, who was summarily executing counter-revolutionaries and anyone who'd served the country under the old guard. And my parents were very much pro-secular democracy. That's what they wanted for Iran. And they saw that that's not the direction that the country's going in. In fact, it was going in the opposite direction. And when I was 20 days old, before any harm came to my father, we managed to escape. And I grew up in London. And we joined my uncle in London. And from early on in my life, I never took any of my freedoms for granted. And when I was 12 or 13, I went to Iran with my mother, and we visited Mashhad and Tehran and Rasht in northern Iran. And my privilege became so glaringly obvious. I was raised in a country where freedom of speech existed, freedom of assembly. Women were equal to men before the law. Child marriage and child labor were illegal. I got to choose if I wanted to wear the hijab or not. And that wasn't the case in Iran. What I saw was people who wanted freedom and really worked hard every day to gain those freedoms. And when I went back to London, I wanted to lend my voice in any way I could to amplify theirs. And it really just became a huge goal in my life to see that freedom prevail.
You know, nobody's career is really a straight line, and yours has certainly had some turns and twists. I believe you started out as a pre-med student at which you really excelled, and then you decided to pursue your passion for acting. You gave a very profound statement in an LA Times interview, which I want to read to you. You say, "I always say as an actor, you get to portray the human condition, whereas as an activist, you get to change the human condition." And I want to know, how did you tell us how you got involved in advocacy and what influenced you or who influenced you along the way.
That's a great question. I thought when I was a child that I wanted to be a doctor because I knew I wanted to help people. And I thought, well, in the Persian culture, medicine is sort of ingrained in our souls, embedded in our consciousness, and that's what we're supposed to do with our lives, is be a doctor or an engineer or a dentist or something academic. And it's very much the struggle of any immigrant to want to see, first generation immigrant families want to see their children succeed. And there's stability in medicine, and there's not an awful lot of stability in the arts. But when I graduated pre-med with honors, which took so much effort for me, it did not come naturally at all. I immediately thought, this cannot be my life, this is not where my heart is. And so I decided to follow my heart and follow my dreams and the arts. But always in the back of my mind, I had there was a dichotomy. How do I help people? And how can the arts help people? And I think that the answer is in that quote that you read that I gave to the LA Times, which is that while as an actor I get to portray the human condition, as an activist with a microphone in my hand and any opportunity I get to amplify the voices of the disenfranchised. And those two things have one thing in common, and that's empathy. You have to have empathy as an artist to be able to step in a character's shoes and portray another human being, another person's story, whether fictional or real. And you have to have empathy to want to change the condition of life for other people for the better. So those two things for me go hand in hand. It's really both sides of who I am, and I can't imagine really doing one without the other. As far as, I think the second part of your question was who influenced me along the way. Definitely my parents. I don't know any first generation immigrant family where the kids don't look up to their parents for the sacrifices they made to give them the best opportunities to succeed in life. And I'm indebted to my parents' resilience and tenacity for leaving everything behind in their homeland and sacrificing so much to give me the best possible start in life. But also there are women's rights pioneers, Iranian women's rights pioneers in particular, Bibi Khanum Asarabadi, for example, and Dr. Farokh Parsa, who was the first education female cabinet minister in Iran, and she was the education minister. And also Rosa Parks in the American Civil Rights Movement, Eleanor Roosevelt for being the driving force for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Emmeline Pankhurst and the suffragettes in the UK. But mostly on a daily basis, I am so inspired by the brave people of Iran who are risking everything for a better future. I sit here comfortably with my rights intact, while human rights lawyers like Sohaila Hijab and Nasrin Sotoudeh languish in jail in Iran. I sit here while human rights activists like Narges Mohammadi, Atena Daemi, and Sabah Kordafshari are also wrongfully imprisoned in Iran. I sit here with the ability to protest against injustices while some say as many as 1,500 or more Iranians were slaughtered on the streets in November 2019 for peacefully protesting against their government. So I don't have to face the bullet in the heart and the head that Pouya Bakhtiari did. And I don't take this freedom for granted. And they inspire me every day to use my platform for them, because they're the ones who are sacrificing everything for freedom.
You know, now I was listening to you talk with such passion and determination really reminds me of when you reached out to me a few years ago about the the simple issue of women not being able to participate in football games in football stadiums. And I remember distinctly how struck I was by your passion and your determination at that time as well. And as you and I very well know, women have been probably the most vocal voice in Iran in terms of, you know, fighting against repression, lack of choice, lack of freedoms. Tell me why that particular issue was so important to you.
Yes, first of all, thank you for signing that important letter to FIFA to demand that Iran ends its discriminatory ban on women entering stadiums. It's as simple as this: women must be equal to men before the law. And that's just not the case in Iran. In any closed society, I think we see that sometimes fighting oppressive laws means you have to break them. And making lives better sometimes means sacrificing your own. And I'm sure you're aware of Sabah Khodayari, also known as Blue Girl, who just last year set herself on fire in protest outside of Iran's revolutionary court as she was about to be sentenced to 6 months in jail for entering a stadium disguised as a man, because that's the only way she could watch the game. And that broke my heart, and it broke so many people's hearts in Iran and across the world. And some may think, well, surely entering a stadium is the least of the worries women have in Iran. And sure, forced hijab or compulsory hijab or entering stadiums may seem like the least of their concerns in a country where women have half the rights of men before the law when it comes to inheritance, or before, in a court of law, where they can't divorce or travel unless they have their husband's permission if they're married, where women have been subjected to unspeakable cruelty for adultery, including stoning. And where girls the legal age of marriage is 13. So you're a girl when you can get married in Iran, you're a child. And sometimes younger if you can get the consent of a judge and the father of the child. These are real issues in Iran. Women can't become president, they can't become a judge or members of the Guardian Council to bring about the changes that they want. So there are much more serious concerns in Iran for women. But for example, the forced hijab has become a symbol of their oppression. They just want the freedom to choose what they put on their head. And that's I think, something that they've started to fight for, because it's become such an outward symbol of their oppression. And with regards to entering a stadium, sometimes people criticize the movement, saying, well, there are much more pressing issues for women in Iran. That's true, but sometimes you start with these steps that you feel like are achievable, and you build it from there, because we need victories. They need victories in Iran. They need to feel like they can bring about change. And so when they start with these steps and they bring about those changes, they go on to face bigger and more challenging obstacles.
Thank you for that. You have said a couple of really important things about the situation of women in Iran, and I really want to do justice to your own words. So I'm just going to quickly read that. You've said that the women protesting in Iran are the Rosa Parkses of Iran. They're protesting against lack of choice and personal freedoms at great personal cost. You've said that what's happening with the Me Too movement, the Time's Up women movement, the Women's March in the US, and the anti-compulsory hijab protests in Iran is not a coincidence. They may not be organized under the same banner, but it's really a global awakening of women's rights. What I want to ask you is, has your experience in Hollywood and the Me Too movement taught you certain things or put you on a certain course? Because what you learned in Hollywood, what you've learned about the power of protest, an experience with the Me Too movement. Tell us a little bit about that.
For me, Me Too is not about a hashtag gone viral. It's about the contagion of courage. And it's very important to me that we lend our voices in America. As I marched in the women's marches alongside so many women who have justifiable grievances here at home when we fight for, while we're fighting for our workplace rights and our dignity. We should know that the women in Iran are fighting for their rights too, but at much greater cost. And while our cause may get a lot of coverage in global media, their cause has gone largely unnoticed and unsupported. And that's what I want to change, is when we fight for women's rights at home, I don't want us to ignore our sisters in Iran who are fighting for their rights, but at far greater cost. And that cost being imprisonment, torture, abuse, harassment, and even death. These are the consequences they face for speaking up against compulsory hijab, against the ban on women entering stadiums, and much, much more than that. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to use this moment, this global awakening of women's rights, to include and be inclusive of every woman who is in this struggle across the world. And that's what women's rights mean to me. There is a reason why Iranian women are dubbed Shirzan or lioness, because of their tenacity in the face of oppression. And we cannot ignore their plight. And I think we're stronger in our goal, in accomplishing our goal, when we are united on a global level.
You know, that's fascinating. Robert Kaplan, who's written so many fascinating books that sort of have come out of his travels all around the world, you know, has said that when he traveled in the Middle East, oftentimes women walked out of the room, not their backs to you, but facing to you, they kind of shuffled out of the room. But in Iran, it was one of the only places where if a woman was in the room with you and they needed to leave, they would just leave and, you know, didn't have to worry about how they were doing that. So that kind of reminded me of that when you were saying that.
I just have one more point. I'm sorry, Goli, but this is a country, when we're talking about Iran, it's important for women in the West, I think, to realize that domestic violence isn't even addressed in Iranian law. So while we're talking about workplace harassment and our rights and domestic violence here, it's important to recognize that in countries like Iran, domestic violence isn't even factored in. It's not even acknowledged by the legal system. And that, again, is something we have to change. But yes, women in Iran, their tenacity is so awe-inspiring, because despite this, for 41 years and more, and much more, there's been a constant struggle, because there's a constant move forward and a demand for dignity and freedom. So I'm just in awe of them.
Yes, and me too. And thank you so much for raising that. You know, Freedom House is giving you the Awareness Award. And this is something that we think is really central to the cause of freedom. You know, you are a successful actress in Hollywood. You're a trailblazer of sorts. Your career is on the up and up. You don't really need to do this. Why are you doing this?
I ask myself that every day. But, you know, the answer is quite simple. I started acting in my mid-20s after I graduated pre-med, as I said earlier. And a lot of people said, well, this is a business. You're starting very late. A lot of people start in acting when they're very, very young, a child. And you're starting very late. You're going to hear no far more often than you hear yes. It's filled with disappointments, and it's a really arduous task to get to your goal. That's just the person I am, I guess, because, you know, when I got the chance to do my advocacy work, I fully was aware that sadly, unfortunately, the victories are few and far between. The thing that keeps you going is every time you succeed at freeing or collectively freeing a prisoner of conscience somewhere in the world, or overturning an oppressive law, or creating greater freedoms in general for people, that motivates me to take the next step forward, as it does with my acting, because I feel like that's a very true statement that we hear no far more often than we hear yes. So those two things, I think it's just part of who I am. I don't really take no for an answer. And so no matter how rare the victories are, each one of those moments motivate me to continue. And again, the common thread being empathy. When you care about people, you want to understand them, whether it's through my work as an actor or through my advocacy work. Those two really go hand in hand.
Thank you for that. You know, I was thinking as you were talking that from your perspective and your years of experience in raising awareness, how do you think governments or civil society organizations or average people can lend their voice to this cause or any other particular cause for that matter, from your perspective?
Yeah, I actually didn't answer the second part of your last question about awareness building, because as important as awareness building is, it doesn't really mean much if we don't have solutions. So I believe in solutions-based advocacy. And what I mean by that is extending the advocacy beyond simply opposing something and focusing on what we're for. What are we trying to achieve? Not just what we're against. And how can we strategically achieve that? Those goals through coalition building, encouraging engaged citizenry, and being proactive and not just reactive. I think what's important is the recognition that we must raise our voices against injustice, while understanding that nothing is likely to change if we don't present and guide solutions, which is why I've gone to the Bundestag in Germany and met with lawmakers there, at the UK Parliament, at the EU, and on Capitol Hill, because I think it's really important to have allies to create change and not just present problems.
And what's been your reaction to some of these meetings? Do you think those individuals that are positions of decision-making and power, are they hearing you? Are they paying attention?
Yes, I think I've had the good fortune of creating strategic partnerships. There are a lot of good people out there, and I don't want people to be discouraged by a lot of what we're seeing in the world, which is polarized politics and people really sidelining human rights or using human rights to fulfill an agenda. Human rights and human dignity should be something we all agree on, regardless of our politics or ideologies. And I think that's what I want to encourage, is for people to put aside their differences and find common ground when it comes to human dignity and defending human dignity.
Nazanin, you've written about the Iranian actress Pego Ahangirani, who was an activist and was imprisoned. I want to know, how did her story impact you, and what drove you to be so focused on her case? I know you've been focused on a lot of other cases, but let's talk about this particular one for now.
Yes, I wrote an op-ed, I believe, in 2014 when she was sentenced to 18 months in prison for her peaceful advocacy and activism. And I just remember she was among several artists and filmmakers at the time who were being imprisoned. And it was in the aftermath of the 2009 Green Movement. There was a string of arrests in the artistic community. And I always find that in closed societies, artists are among the group of people who are censored and silenced first, alongside lawyers, academics, journalists, and anybody who really can establish lines of communication and reach a lot of people in their country. And there's a reason for that, because they have a voice and they can defend the rights of the people. They can communicate and encourage thoughts and ideas. And there's nothing that scares an oppressive regime more than that kind of exchange. And that's why we saw that wave of arrests of artists. And Pega's story really struck a chord with me, because I kept thinking, I've never had to face arrest or intimidation for raising my voice for the more vulnerable people in society. I've never had to, I can't fathom what that would be like, to face that kind of oppression, a prison sentence, simply for speaking my mind and trying to help people. So that really struck me, that we were both working actresses, and yet her journey was so different to mine. And I really wanted to, again, not take my privilege for granted and lend my voice to hers, as she had so bravely lent her voice to those who are less fortunate.
Yeah, certainly a very inspiring story. Thank you for that. You know, I want to hear a little bit about the work that you did with refugees in France and the documentary that came out of that. And that was, I think if I'm not mistaken, it was focused on children. Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Of course. It's called Stateless, and it's 6.5 minutes. It's a short docu-film that I filmed in July 2019 with a wonderful crew of people who essentially donated their time and resources, for the most part, to making this film with me. And what it's about is asylum seekers in northern France, in Calais and Dunkirk, who are caught between a homeland where their lives are at risk, or homelands where their lives are at risk, and an international community that rejects them. And that was the focus, as I met with people from everywhere, from Syria to the Gambia, from Kuwait and Afghanistan to Sudan and Iran, my homeland of Iran. And of course, I spent most of my time talking to people who could speak Persian, because I could speak Persian, but there were a lot of people I spoke to. A lot of them were too afraid to appear on camera because of the situation they were in. And it really tugged at my heartstrings, and really made me even more determined to want to continue what I'm doing. I've spent the past 12 years of my life championing the rights of people in Iran. And it was very important to me not to only have dialogue with people inside Iran through a computer, but to see some of them firsthand who had just left Iran. Some of them had just arrived in Dunkirk, for example, or Calais, days before I met them. And there was a very sobering young boy. I met a young boy, and it was a very sobering story. He had a autistic younger brother. This boy was eight years old. Arvin was his name, Iranian. And they'd been at the camp for, I think, about 10 months. And I asked him, what do you want to be when you grow up? And he said, a doctor. And I said, why do you want to be a doctor? And he explained that he wanted to help people who weren't feeling better, feel better. And I said, like your brother? I asked him, and he said, yes, like my brother. And thankfully, he has made it to the UK and he started school, but that is not the case for most of them. And what I want the world to know is that, yes, we have to continue fighting against the injustices that are at the heart and at the core of the refugee crisis. But in the meantime, we cannot turn a blind eye to the suffering of refugees who, as I said, are caught between either death at home and not being able to survive at home because of conflict or persecution, and are displaced to countries that are not accepting them. And that has to change.
You know, in listening to you, it sounds to me like you've had many occasions where you've been delighted by the kind of work you do, and there's been occasions where you've been sad about the type of work you do. Can you sort of from the heart give us a couple of examples of some of these feelings that you've referred to?
I mean, I'll start with the negative and hopefully end on a positive. The challenges are always, advocates don't have, there would be nothing for us to do. We wouldn't have to do this work if there wasn't opposition. That's what advocacy is about changing minds, changing laws. And so I find myself constantly opposed by various people who want the status quo to stay in place. And as long as those oppressive laws and oppression in general exists, activists will have to do their jobs. And that is a constant challenge that every activist faces. And of course, there's the battles we lose, the people who are executed, wrongfully executed, that we've been campaigning for. Seeing, again, the people in the refugee camps that I saw, but also on the streets of Haiti and in the slums of India and the townships of South Africa, the suffering I've seen firsthand can become overwhelming when you witness it. But there's also the beautiful side of it, which is the resilience of these people. The fact that the kids I saw in the townships in South Africa were smiling ear to ear, because they seem to be, seem to take life far less for granted than most of us who have much greater freedoms. That was inspiring to me. And the aspect that I live for, and I'm inspired by constantly, well, I should get back to one other aspect that is a bit daunting, which is activists, as you see, are assassinated across the world. I mean, we're seeing cases left, right, and center of people who speak up to power, speak out against injustices and speak truth to power, and lose their lives as a result, even if they're not in Iran. Iranian dissidents abroad, as we've seen across the world, whether it was the Mykonos murders in Germany in the 90s and elsewhere, and to this day, people are at risk for speaking out. And there's also the cyber element. There's a very concerted effort by governments like Iran to silence activists through cyber attacks, smear campaigns. I've personally had hack attempts on several of my email accounts and what have you. I mean, it's not something that we experience these kinds of threats every day, but again, it pales in comparison to what people in Iran are actually facing. And so I'm encouraged every day by the victories. Every time we manage to collectively, with the help of every NGO and every activist across the world, because no single person can accomplish this, we overturn oppressive laws, we free the prisoner of conscience, we reunite families, and that makes it all worth it.
Nazanin, Freedom House called 2019 the year of protest, and we are certainly seeing the sentiment continue in 2020 with the civil rights protests in the United States, in Hong Kong, and in Iran. Do you think these protests are going to have a lasting effect?
I hope so. You know, I was very inspired by the renewed civil rights movement in America this year, and I absolutely condemn police brutality here or anywhere, or brutality by state security forces in Iran, which unfortunately we witnessed in November 2019, where, as I said before, hundreds of Iranians suffered bullets to the head and the heart for doing exactly what people were doing here, and protesting against their government. I was so heartened by the global solidarity with the American civil rights protests. I was very heartened by the global media coverage about the protests in America. And I think what's lacking is that same kind of global solidarity for the people of Iran, for the people of Lebanon, for the people of Syria and Yemen who are suffering. And we just haven't given them the proper attention, their plight, the proper attention that they ask for and they demand and they deserve. You know, I recently saw a video of a man in Idlib, an artist in Idlib, Syria, who was standing amidst the ruins of Idlib. And there was a lone wall, crumbled wall standing, on which he painted a mural of George Floyd. And it was so inspiring to me that this man, who was standing in these ruins and had suffered, he and his people had suffered such grave injustices, and suffered so much while the world frankly turned away from their suffering, had the empathy in his heart that extended beyond his borders. His empathy was limitless. It wasn't confined by his borders or just for his people. He wasn't saying, yes, but what about us? He was saying, we share your suffering, because essentially an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And my goodness, I walked away from that thinking, we all want to say, yes, but what about us? Whereas what we should be saying is, we are all in this together. And excuse me if I get emotional, but that is, in essence, what advocacy is about. Is if we stand for George Floyd, which we must, we stand for the rights of George Floyd and every person who suffers police brutality in the United States. We cannot ignore Pooya Bakhtiari, who was shot to death in the protests in Iran in November 2019, or the people suffering in Syria or Yemen, or the injustices in Hong Kong, Lebanon, and beyond. And when you call yourself a human rights advocate, it's all inclusive. You don't turn a blind eye. And I encourage the global media to change in that regard and cover the suffering worldwide. And I know there's a lot out there, but we cannot learn about, the people of America, the West, the world, cannot learn about and have empathy for people we don't see, whose suffering we don't see. And so the first step in raising awareness, and I am so grateful for this acknowledgement in raising awareness, but I'm calling on my media, friends in the media, to open their hearts to the suffering of others and cover those stories more, and to raise awareness in America, in Europe, and elsewhere, so that kids growing up here see their counterparts in Syria, in Yemen, and Iran, and everywhere else, in Hong Kong. And they know that we should all stand united against injustice.
You know, Nazanin, watching you talk sort of reminds me of the special relationship that artists have with freedom of expression. And I can tell how important that is to you, because you truly become emotional about these issues. Yet we've also heard that artists oftentimes are criticized for becoming activists. And some people think, well, you just stay in your own lane and don't cross over. What are your thoughts on that? How do you feel about that?
I think, as I alluded to before, artists are in a unique position to reach people. We have a platform from which to speak, and that scares a lot of closed societies and the leaders of closed societies and oppressive regimes and tyrannical dictators. They don't want that line of communication or influence that artists have. But since time immemorial, there's been a sort of a synergy between arts and advocacy. And yes, that sometimes that combination has been controversial because of what artists may have said. But let's not forget that sometimes people we pay and elect to know and do better also make controversial statements or do controversial things. So the key, I think, for artists is to get informed, properly informed about issues they truly care about, and advocate for them as any other citizen would and should, and be very much a part of the political fabric of their country and the world. And that, I think, is everybody's right. And that's what democracy and freedom is about, is the ability to freely express your ideas. And I think artists in general have a very unique relationship to the freedom of expression, because we rely so heavily on it in our work. And so we, I think, organically feel the need to protect that right wherever we see it violated. And that's, I think, truthfully, where that urge for advocacy comes for many artists. And I hope they continue. I think it's very important that we keep raising our voices, and that we're not cowered into silence in a climate that, frankly, is becoming you know, we're becoming increasingly risk averse. But there's inherent risks to advocacy that we have to take on, because there are people in this world who want to hold on to the status quo of silencing people and taking away people's freedoms and rights, and oppressing society. And I think with that comes a huge responsibility for those of us who have a microphone in our hands to speak truth to power.